I'm Andrea Lynn, and I am recording this intro immediately after recording my interview because I feel like I'm not very animated or interested seeming in my intros typically. So this is me trying to be a little bit more, I guess, charismatic in my intros. So, anywho, I spoke with Jay Shapiro, the director of the documentary Islam and the Future of Tolerance. We speak about that a little bit, but then we move on to talk about the IDW, or the intellectual dark web. We talk about what it actually is. Is it a group of people? Is it a way of doing discourse? We focus particularly on the I, the intellectual, and what do those types of intellectual debates and discussions look like? And we even cover a few examples. It was very organic, it flowed really well, and I just thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed myself. And I think I'm going to say that Jay did as well. So I'm really interested to hear what you guys think. If you agree with some of the topics or disagree, and if you could leave comments explaining what you thought about our chat, that would be great. If you want to follow me or Jay on Twitter, I will have our Twitter handles in the description. So yeah, without further ado, here is my chat with Jay. Hi, thanks for chatting with me. And yeah, I appreciate you taking the time.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, so you directed a movie called Islam and the Future of Tolerance with,
Correct.
yes, with, you know the title.
I do know.
But they don't. So that's why I'm going over it. Okay. So it has Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz in it and a couple other people. And I kind of saw it as a way to have hard conversations. That's kind of how it, like, that was my impression at the end. So can you tell me a little bit about, I guess, how you, that's the message I got. Is that kind of?
It's based on the book of the same title that was literally just a transcript of a dialogue that Sam and Majid had together. This is sort of old news at this point. So they called it Islam and the Future of Tolerance. And to your point, that whole story between them started with like a fight. We tell the story at the beginning of the film. It was a debate here in New York, actually, now back in like 2010 with Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Douglas Murray and Majid. And Sam was just in the audience. And in the after party at the dinner, basically, where the conversation was just continuing, Sam and Majid got into it. It almost came to blows, apparently, if you listen to Ayan's retelling of it. And, just a position that we've all sort of been in. And this person just doesn't want to talk. And it all fell apart really quickly. But then 4 years later, Sam reached out to Majid again to sort of try again with the conversation. And they had such a productive, it was actually 2 phone calls over a couple days that they decided.
Was it recorded? Is that what
you
put in the documentary?
Yeah, so we sort of used the original audio recording, which then became basically the transcript of the book, as sort of the backbone for the second and third act of the film. And then we basically just recreate the conversation. And then we did these in-depth interviews with both men, kind of going over the arguments again and in a visual sense, and then remembering kind of what the original conversation was like. And then we got them back together again in New York at the original restaurant where they first fought to just, that was the most fun part for me as the director, is that was the part where I just sat them in the chairs and said, all right, just keep going. Like, I'm done directing now, just continue the conversation. So yeah, so it was absolutely, hopefully an example for all of us to hopefully model that it's possible at least to have conversations that are productive. We could talk a lot about, I think, because there's a lot of criticisms of it. Also, what's a really fun part about being the director of the film is that I'm not beholden to either men's argument in full, or even the enterprise totally. Because I've been interested in this conversation since my college years. I was a sophomore when 9/11 hit, and that's when I first started noticing that conversation about this particular topic, and a lot of topics was really strained. And maybe I was starting to see the writing on the wall very early that this is going to be a really really painful decade. Started really following like the New Atheist conversations in books like Sam and Hitchens and Dennett and Dawkins, and was rather convinced by Sam's guess and warning in some sense that if we fail to have this conversation honestly and openly, people that we really don't want to have the conversation are going to have it for us. For a long time, for a decade, I think people were doubting that, maybe calling it alarmist or not. Now, with the Trump election and sort of the rise of the far right in a lot of the world, I think very few people are doubting that hypothesis anymore. And now, what do we do about it is a very different question. But yeah, so that was sort of like my journey into it. But I am also very close with a lot of the ex-Muslim and Reform Muslim community that have very mixed feelings about Majid's enterprise generally, and there's a lot of conversations that are really valid about about Majid's efforts generally, and maybe Sam shifting from sort of a philosophical conversation to a very overtly political one with Majid. And maybe that being a misstep in some grand scale that maybe we can get into and talk about. But generally, yes, it was two men sitting down who really disagreed about some fundamental issues on page one, trying to hash it out and trying to figure out, in that case, maybe not what was true, but what is a politically effective way forward in the conversation. So that's IDW-ish for sure, I would say.
Right, because that's the other thing I want to talk with you about is, what is the IDW? Is it a group of people or is it a way of talking? Like even the conversation it wasn't even really a conversation. It was just sort of the two perspectives where when you film them in the sort of parking garages.
Right,
Yeah. So I thought that it was a really fair and balanced, I guess, portrayal of what each man thought was the way forward.
Yeah.
And it looked not like one was being promoted over the other. Because I know, like, I've been following a lot of these ex-Muslims actually on Twitter. I more or less regularly listen to the Secular Jihadist podcast, and so I knew, actually, I think everyone who is not new, I know of everyone who's interviewed, and so I know that like most ex-Muslims really, and Sam, I know that he really disagrees with Majid's, I guess, more reforming and sort of we need to reinterpret and have some play rather than with the literal interpretation. We need to have a metaphorical interpretation. And I saw and then of course you showed Sam's perspective but you showed them both. But I didn't feel like you really highlighted Sam's more or Majid's more. It was sort of like both were presented in a really fair way. And I thought that was because it wasn't really a debate. It was just to kind of introduce people to that concept, I think.
And in some ways that conversation was Majid trying to convince Sam that this political strategy is not dishonest, which we could talk about, and is maybe necessary, which we could also talk about, and maybe the best idea on the table at the moment. And Sam worries about that out loud, but also can admit that like he doesn't have a better idea, frankly, at the moment either. He's said in the past, and I wrote an article about why I made the film, and I referenced a very old debate he did in the early days of these conversations with Reza Aslan, someone famously who he's tangled with, where Sam, says on that stage, listen, I'm not a diplomat, I'm not a politician. The politicians shouldn't speak like me. Now, that's I think probably still true, or he thinks, and there's Majid basically trying to answer that question for Sam of like, okay, if you think politicians shouldn't speak like you, Sam, maybe this is how they should speak. And that's in some ways kind of the conversation they try to weave there. So yeah, it's certainly not a debate. It's Sam listening to Majid's pitch, his sales pitch in a lot of ways, and expressing worry about it, but then also obviously hoping he succeeds ultimately if the reform movement in the Muslim world succeeded in a way that looked anything like the Reform movement in Christianity or the Reform movement in Judaism, we would be in a better place. But the work would not be done. And I think that's an important thing to talk about maybe in the IDW conversation of is it a political conversation or is it a philosophical conversation? What is it really there? Because in a lot of ways, people like myself, I think a lot like Sam, and I listen to Majid, and I also hope the Reform movement works. And it's almost like you're the firefighters trying to put out this fire, and maybe you're in a better position to do it than me. So I hope you put out the fire. But as soon as you do, we got to talk about some stuff. But they're still fighting the fire. And a lot of, I think, Sam and maybe myself, the instinct at this point is to sort of just like get out of the way, look the other way, hope they can pull it off, support them from afar as much as we can. But as soon as they support it, or if they pull it off and they pull off some reform movement in some legitimate way, well, I see zero daylight between the Majid who pulls that off, or someone who works with him, someone like Usama Hassan, and Rabbi David Wolpe, who's like an academic of the Reform Judaism movement, who rightfully tangled with Hitchens and Harris himself and people like that about his theological claims. I wonder if we're putting the theological conversations on the back burner too much in the hopes that the reform conversation can't coexist with it. And that may be a fatal flaw in it. Majid even points to it somewhere in the film. But yeah, there you go. It's fun being the director of it because I can just sort of like, I could criticize it, even though I made it, which is fun, which I think is the point.
Because I knew I don't know how long I've known you, a few months, I don't know, a month. I knew you were on basically the same side as Sam's, the way you both see it. I don't know how, I just knew it. I just knew it.
It's true. That is the way that I found the conversation from the beginning. So yeah, absolutely.
And that is why I applaud you the way you sort of presented both sides. I did appreciate that because again, so I can see from Majid's side, like you can't ask, I know how many Muslims are there? Under a billion, hundreds of millions of Muslims to abandon their faith and become atheists. Like you can ask them.
Someone like Armin Navabi certainly thinks you can. Yeah, and I'm agnostic about that effort, whether what you said is just true or not. I would hope so. But yes,
that's why I'm just like, I can see why Majid's coming at it from that side, because if you can work with it, even because I have a degree in like Christian history, so in my memory banks from my degree 10 years ago. It took a long time to get here for Christianity, but even then the text, and same with the Judaism, it's always been interpreted. It's always had a sort of an encouragement to interpret the text in a way that is culturally compatible. The fact that we have Easter on the same day as, literally the name Easter is like a goddess name, like we let's just put our Christian festivals in with these, the local deities. Let's just integrate. Like that's kind of, you can reform. We've kind of always made it fit with culture more or less.
I don't know about always, but yeah.
Or you could argue.
It hasn't been such a smooth ride.
What?
It's not such a smooth ride always with Christianity.
Many were burned and much blood flew.
Still does.
Much blood has flown.
I also like one thing I always like to point out of, although it hasn't really happened loudly, which is great, of people if they're claiming that I have like an Islamophobic focus on Islam or something like that, I'm very quick to remind people that I've traveled extensively in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm well aware of just how far off the rails Christian theology can go given the right circumstances even today. So I certainly, I'm an equal opportunity religion critic for sure. But I just happened to make a film about,
My concern though with Islam is that it's never been open to alternate interpretations. It's always been literal.
It has a lot of really difficult problems. It has a lot of, well, yeah, I mean, even that sentence would probably be challenged by a lot of Muslims, maybe rightfully so, but it has particular challenges that are real in the text itself. The fact that there's no priest or no pope. There's a lot of challenges that it has to face. The text itself is written in a much more overt political structure way than it's less metaphorical. There's challenges for it. It's done it before. Hopefully could do it again. I'm working with Ideas Beyond Borders and Faisal Al-Mutar and Melissa Chen and their whole group on this incredible translation movement in the Muslim world. They're calling it Beit al-Hikmah 2.0, which is a reference to the House of Wisdom House of Wisdom, the original, which, the golden age of Islam, where algebra is an Arabic word and 2/3 of the stars in the sky are Arabic names. So it hasn't always been the enemy of even scientific progress. Yeah.
Well, medieval Spain. There's a book I need to read called The Ornament of the World, and it was an old textbook of mine. I took an Islamic studies course, and that was actually in the midst of the Dark Ages. Medieval Spain had Muslims, Jews, and Christians living very peacefully in they were ahead of the curve for like you were saying with astronomy and math, and they were doing quite well in the midst of a lot of, I don't know, I guess Black Death and whatever else.
Yeah. So hopefully again, but also I'm a pretty we could talk about the IDW and atheism and the overlap there if there is anything to talk about there, but I'm a pretty strong atheist when defined, I think, correctly, and it's always been an intellectual kind of balancing act for me to make the film I made and talk about reform Islam and reforming any religion generally, and not, and bite my tongue at certain times.
I applaud your film because I knew it was, you were actually just not just saying, oh, I think that this is the stronger argument. You were just presenting both arguments. So that's why I wanted to point that out.
Cool.
That was...
Thanks. It's on Amazon. It's on iTunes. It's still out there. We're still trying to pull off the streaming sale, but it's on all the VOD platforms, so you could find it, definitely.
Yeah. Because I watched it before this interview because I wanted to be able to talk about it specifically. I've been meaning to watch it for a while, but I just I need to watch it now. So yeah, it's great. People who are all 100 of you watching this. Well, maybe I'll get more subscribers.
Yeah.
Anyways, okay, so hard conversations. I'd like to maybe move into, I've been kind of on a quest to figure out the intellectual dark web, or IDW as it has been coined. I spoke with Ryan Bennett, a mutual friend of ours, a few weeks ago, and I just released it yesterday.
Yep.
Thank you for watching it so quickly, by the way.
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of, it's been criticized recently about being, I guess, too like conservative leaning, I guess. But again, that's from the perspective of it being a group of people. And again, so if you look over at the group, even that's its own debate of, are they conservative-ish? Like, are they, no. Are they not critical of the right enough? Like, that was the critique. But if we're not even talking about a group, the conversation is even different from that. So there's a couple different veins we could go in. So I was just wondering, and even if you kind of go over some of the same things that Ryan spoke about, how do you see the IDW?
Well,
yeah, I could tell you how I want to see it, what I hope it is. People have been, so people have obviously noticed an energy here. Like, it's, you notice the view count on certain YouTube's pages, or how many people are buying tickets for like a Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson event, and you notice this energy, you see this undercurrent of conversation. So giving it a name, calling the phenomenon something, seems natural. I'm a little bit hesitant even to throw a name at it, but it accidentally stuck. And from the beginning, people have been trying to ask these same questions. I think the first time that that particular label, intellectual dark web, exited sort of the small ecosystem of podcasts that we know, I guess it was Waking Up, now called Making Sense, Sam's podcast at the time with Eric Weinstein, was Barry Weiss writing an article in the New York Times with those very funny photos of of everybody in like the weeds. Yeah, it was a really clever photo shoot. And she raised a lot of these questions very early of like, what is this thing? And I really commended her article. And we're going to have to end up talking about Dave Rubin as well. But Dave was the particular one, even in that article early, being like, is this guy in or out? And it was already sort of an open question. Or is what what he's up to, is that a part of this thing or not?
If I could just interject, because it's him and Joe who were there. They weren't claiming to be the intellectual part.
Yeah, the fact that Joe got lumped into it is crazy. But I mean, you've noticed, I'm sure, like the way that I've been tweeting about it lately. She raised a lot of these questions very early. I used to give some sort of definition about it of like, well, these are people, well, it could be anyone, but it's the effort. In this case, it's a group of people at the time who are willing to seek true answers to difficult questions, and be courageous and unafraid to ask difficult questions on the way to get to that truth that are traditionally sort of out of bounds. And I think that's great. So talking, like, not being afraid to talk about things like race and IQ and correlations, like very touchy taboo subjects, or abortion, or, well, I guess that's not even taboo, but just like off limits things. Race, is the gender.
It's hard.
It's hard. Yeah. Well, that's hard, but something like, is the gender gap real, would be like sacrilege to people. So like being able to ask these questions along the way to finding the truth, I think still holds of what I want it to be. Even that, though, demands that it is not a political movement. Finding the truth is not political. Finding the truth is philosophical. That's what I've always been in it for. That's what I'm interested in it for. That activity, I think, if you call that the intellectual dark web, I'm all for it. Anyone could be in it. Some people could be better at it than other people. So then if there's a group of people, hopefully it's people who are really good at it. That's a skill that takes time to learn. I'm trying to get better at the skill every day. I'm not always great at it. We could talk about people like Dave Rubin or Joe Rogan if they're even trying to do that.
I know Joe didn't really want to be.
Yeah, he did. Yeah,
he thought it was dumb. But.
And what's like the I don't think the name itself is so bad. I think even Ryan said this, being like, it'll be a shame if we lose it because it's so well like labeled. But the first word in it of intellectual, I think, is the word that people are just really underplaying, of like, what is an intellectual? What does it mean to be intellectual? What does that demand of yourself if you are going to claim to be an intellectual? What is the game of being an intellectual? That's something that needs to be like deeply considered, because when I talk about seeking truth, you have to talk about what adjudicates the truth.
Well, I mean, was it Jordan Peterson and Sam having it? Yeah. How many hours?
Which was terrific. I wish I could have been there to moderate it, because I think I could have helped them get to their disagreement a lot earlier. Frankly, none of it's really new. It's pragmatism. It's an old philosophical definition of truth. And Sam is a bit more of a moral objectivist. And so they were using the term just a little bit differently, and it could have been cleaned up really, really early. And I think there's better questions to ask them that get to the point. They eventually got there in that little debate series they did. They eventually, I think, tried to get to that bedrock. But yeah, that conversation, I would think, is totally an IDW conversation. They were just still trying to define what adjudicates the truth. This goes back to really old philosophy, David Hume, the is-ought question. This is, and for me, this is the real work of hopefully the intellectual dark web, and hopefully what it means to be an intellectual is asking yourself why all the fucking time, and then trying to answer the why, and asking people across from you why all the damn time. And if they appeal to a support of the why that they think is self-manifest, like God says so or something, That's not good enough in the intellectual game. That's not good enough. Or you have to say why. And if they check out of the conversation and they say that's just the way it is, or that's just what I think, well, then you've hit their rock bottom. If their rock bottom is at some surface level, like this is a boring conversation and then this is just a political pissing match. But if they're willing to get under it, of talking about why and going deeper, and clearly Jordan and Sam are. I think Jordan and Sam's disagreement is better expressed than even the two men did themselves on that stage, I think. But it's a really important one, and actually points to I think a genuine philosophical split in quote unquote IDW crowds. And I would still call it, let's call it, I don't want to just label all of Jordan's people who side with Jordan on that particular bedrock as religious people, but I would call them...
They're usually more on the more conservative end or centrist, is what it seems like to me from what I've seen.
That's where they would come out, I think, politically.
So
but
yeah,
I would say,
you don't want to use the political spectrum for it, do you? Because of philosophically.
I think the grounding underneath the politics is always philosophical. And I think the general difference, I mean, we could get into the weeds with this here, but I think if there's a split in the crowd of sort of the Sam Harris people on that stage and the Jordan Peterson people on that stage, yeah, I don't want to just call the Jordan Peterson people religious, but they're pessimistic that atheism as a philosophy, or let's say pure secular morality, is possible. And they're pessimistic of that enterprise not leading to a horror show like communism or Auschwitz or whatever they envision. And these are fair conversations to have, where the people who, and I would put myself not in that camp, saying the whole interesting conversation is how to build a moral civil society and civilization and find moral progress without the religion, without bullshit. And that is hard work. And that's always why I've been attracted to Sam in the original sort of Four Horsemen, more so than like a Richard Dawkins, where he was able to have that conversation with Jordan, or try to, because he doesn't dismiss that worry of Jordan as crazy or wacky. He admits that religion does something, or has historically done something, and maybe he's right that just intrinsically does something that is irreplaceable and cannot be erased.
Like meaning, right? Meaning, really.
Meaning, possibly that the universe that we find ourselves in is just too tragic to actually face. These are all like potential things. The fact that Sam wonders that there may be truths that are better left unknown. This doesn't mean we shouldn't try to find them, but it's possible that we learn something that actually was better left unknown. And one of those things may be the Nietzsche God is dead. May have been a better, Jordan might say, better left unknown. I don't want to speak for him outright, but the fact that Sam knows that that's not a totally crazy thought is actually, I think that's where the entire conversation is. I wish more of the Jordan fans would have a little more optimism in a David Deutsch sense. He's my favorite thinker. Optimism that it's the way to find meaning is actually abandoning God totally as a concept, as an incoherent concept that doesn't match the universe. And that's great. For me, that's quite easy. But then the hard work is actually, what do you do now? How do you build meaning in your own life, meaning in connections with other people? Sam's gone down certainly down the meditation path as ways to talk about this kind of stuff. But anyway, I mean, like we could get back to sort of like the political outcomes that come out of that very deep philosophical stance that people find themselves, or even intuitions, and certainly they surface as more liberal and more conservative. But that's
right.
Almost not point.
Well, and even you bringing up the different sort of ways the conversations have gone with, say, like with Peterson and Harris, and with others as well before them, of course. But that sort of, whenever Jordan Peterson would be like, well, it depends on what you mean by blank, you know? I used to always be annoyed at that, but I get it now. It depends on what you mean by God.
Yeah, if you've taken a philosophy class, it's just all literally
it depends on what you mean by the thing. Yes, and it's that's vital in these sort of conversations. So
yes.
Anyway, so that conversation.
I mean, because they feel very easy. For an example of like a concrete one that I think actually surfaced oddly at the end of your conversation with Ryan was abortion. If you're getting into the abortion debate and you're being like life begins at conception, or like you get focused on these weird sentences, the question is, well, what do you mean by life? That's a really hard philosophical question of when is something alive? What does that even mean? And you're talking about consciousness, and you're talking about all these, but that's the important work. If you're gonna do, if this intellectual dark web is worth its salt in anything, it's got to be willing to do the work and not just sort of like drum up these platitudes of contrarian opinions and, you know, pissing off the college freshman who thinks there's 85 genders. Like, if that's what it is, like, great, that's boring. Maybe it serves a utility. I have like no interest. That's not an intellectual movement. It's maybe like a political corrective movement, which is sort of, you know, interesting, but like, like a course correcting like effort in some ways. I think that's like what someone like Dave Rubin would say he's doing in some regard on a very targeted, obviously like target for him. But that's not an intellectual movement.
Okay, but I can see where they're coming from if they're worried about freedom of speech, which is, you know, ability to then think and do the intellectual work.
Yes.
That's where the leftist thing and is a concern, I think. So that might be why that is focused on.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, I mean, we saw Brett Weinstein's or Mike Nenya's interview with Brett and the third installment of his Evergreen series. You watched it. You did watch it today.
I watched it.
Right. Yeah. And that is a speech limiting situation from that far left space. So I can see again why, like, especially for Brett Weinstein, why he'd be particularly concerned about it bleeding through. But it's not the only space we need to be looking at, which is what it might seem to be, I think, from what you're saying.
Well, and if it's, I guess we'll go to like the second word in the definition, and if it's dark, then it sort of implies that we're like intentionally like we're like hiding in the corner having these conversations in the shadows anyway. So if like the darkness is like, we're going to get away from the Evergreen campus and actually go into the basement and have these conversations.
Each of the weeds,
and it's totally legitimate what you're saying of like, if you want to step out of that darkness and go like fight the kids on the college campus because it is this growing concern, and I totally agree it is. Yeah, that's almost like a different practice. Certainly related, I'm with you, but like a different practice. It's not the like it's not the conversations that you have till 3 a.m. with your buddy about the Fermi's paradox as a college freshman. That feels like what the intellectual dark web at its best is, but like at a deeper end of the pool with like continuing that. So we're not just college freshmen anymore, but actually going deeper into the woods of these things because they really matter. And it's becoming more and more taboo to have these in the mainstream, certainly. So it's almost like, you know, it's like a different battlefront of the it's like people trying to knock down the door, in my weird analogy of we're in the basement and the kids are knocking down the door, and then Dave Rubin might see himself as the bodyguard. I don't know if that works at all.
Kind of reminiscent of the, you know, being barricaded in, you know, the teacher's lounge.
Although I do want to point out that there's other targets to free speech, or threats to free speech beyond the left on the college campus that are certainly going unchallenged, which we should do. Yeah.
Like which things are sort of unchallenged?
Well, so I think I get a little bit frustrated when I see the hyper focus on the cliche that I already gave you of like the college freshman with these just objectively terrible ideas in their head of all of these things, who's very emotional and very upset and trigger warnings and all this kind of stuff. And there's an equivalent of that is equally naive, maybe differently dangerous, but equally naive on the same college campus that I know is there, of the people who are on the other side of the gutter, who have become these like ultra libertarian, don't tread on me, you know, Ayn Rand worshipers, who are also very young and naive and have found sort of a one-sentence philosophy the same way those other kids did. They found their framework that they think is a solvent for every single issue in the world, and this is it. They found their answer. They also need challenging. But all these kids are young. Like I also feel like we should I remember myself as a 19-year-old, and like I was an idiot. Like if I could go back now, I'm 36, and in a time machine, I would destroy myself in a debate as a 19-year-old. Destroy, like rightfully, and hopefully I could say the same thing when I'm 50, that I'll come back here and just like notice all my errors. But maybe we're a little too hard on 19-year-olds who think they have it all figured out. It maybe just because of social media, and as James Lindsay's been really dead on about pointing out what's happening on college's campus. Like they have all the power and seemingly the financial power at the moment, and their platforms and political influence are large, too large for dumb 19-year-olds, and that's true. But there's dumb 19-year-olds that find themselves in this SJW left, and dumb 19-year-olds who find themselves on the anti-SJW left, who end up just being like hardcore libertarians, which is a very lazy intellectual position to be in. And is a threat to just general sort of humanity, to just to think that that's a solvent for every political ill, and that psychology, it's sort of a denial of psychology and denial of human psychology. There's a lot of good articles out there showing like why are there no libertarian utopias in the world, and it's because if you let the free market run on its own and you worship the free market, it fails in a lot of areas because of imbalances in our human psychology, like short-term thinking or not wanting what we really want, or it can't solve every problem. It can't solve things like healthcare, if you ask me, very effectively. It certainly can't solve things like a military, so that's always where they concede. Like there's areas where you could start with a default position of libertarianism and then just figure out where you have to chip away at that statue and see what you're left with, which is, I guess, sort of the American enterprise. But yeah.
Well, I have a question then. Why do you think that they're not being challenged from, say, the sort of IDW thinking perspective?
Maybe the free speech fetish. Maybe you're right that it's that they're not challenging free speech. They worship free speech in this way that is is the right answer. But it also it ushers in, and it allows some. It can go too far, the same way the other end can go too far. Like should you have an actual neo-Nazi speaking on a college campus? I think no. Like life's short. We don't have to hear every stupid idea out there. Should you have a flat earther convention at Harvard just in like honor of free speech?
Because they paid for it.
Yeah, but like it's like, do you really like want to do this? Okay, like go down that road if you want. But then of course, yeah. I mean, they're right. Ben Shapiro, as much as I disagree with him, is not a Nazi or a white supremacist, and obviously should be able to speak and has fine arguments that I think need to be challenged and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess from the IDW crowd, they don't get challenged quite as much as they ought to. Certain people do, and certain figures do, or at least push back when those 19-year-olds find themselves not having an actual philosophy of life, but just an anti-SJW philosophy of life, and end up, like supporting Donald Trump really as just like a middle finger to the idiots in their college classroom, which is, again, 19-year-olds are 19. And
well, maybe maybe I kind of think it's because they're not really forming protests that are needing security to keep speakers safe, like those libertarian groups, or maybe that's why they're not as focused on. I don't know. But this actually brings us back to the question: is the IDW a group of people, or is it a way of doing dialogue and discourse? And
it's a
method. I think it's a method and a way of doing discourse. My definition of like the seeking truth. I didn't get to fully flesh out the thought of. But because we went off on the Sam and Jordan conversation, but it's seeking truth, and that can be, like I said, like people who are good at it and bad at it, and so I don't mind pointing to people being like, oh, like that's an IDW personality or figure, but yeah, it can't be a membership because you can. It's like a sport. It's like LeBron James is a basketball player, and he's a really good.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a skill. I mean, critical thinking is a skill. This isn't just like a thing that maybe some people are just like naturally good at it, the way LeBron James might be naturally good at basketball. It's a skill that not everyone can do. But if LeBron James starts missing every shot he takes and decides, that he's gonna dribble with his foot instead of his hand, well, then he's gonna be a bad basketball player. And it's possible that certain personalities or people who are good at this kind of thinking also make plenty of mistakes and have bad games and bad days, and I think that's fine. But the terms of what the sport is, for me, again, I'm hoping this is what it is, because the word intellectual is the whole thing for me. For me, I can't, I'm having trouble velcroing that away from just general scientific thinking and critical thinking in the broadest sense possible, which is always the willingness to be wrong, the knowledge that you're probably wrong, being wrong actually scores you points, like all of the things that make science a method rather than the same way that science is a method and not just, a bunch of books on your shelf with answers in them, or even just a bunch of math equations. It's a method for how we arrived at those things, and how those things are still just the best guesses and the best theory and the model of the universe that we have at the moment. That's what the IDW has to be. What adjudicates the truth of the IDW? I think maybe like my best recent tweet of just being frustrated with this stuff was saying, like, the boring version of the IDW is proof that two people who disagree strongly about important things can be friends and sit next to each other. Like that's like the hurdle that's 1 inch off the ground, if you ask me. And then the real one is the, like, two people who disagree strongly about something that's important can sit and be friends and figure out if one of them is right or wrong and do the work to try to really get into those weeds. That's the interesting part. That's what I think people want to see and want to know. It's like,
well, I'm thinking Sam and Majid, like, that's the high hurdle that you're talking about. The fact that they both, and they haven't, like, said, oh, and you're right, or you're right, because they're still there. They're still.
Yeah, they got pretty high, and they bracketed the terms of what they were going to try to do in that conversation right off the bat, which was Sam saying, like, I don't want to have a conversation about whether God exists here. He explicitly was like, let's have a political conversation about what we should do and say about this thing, and then is the reform effort honest? Because his initial charge to Majid was like, I hope you succeed, but aren't you just lying when you're trying to pull this thing off? So that's a pretty high hurdle that they tried to jump over, and I think they did it successfully. I think there's higher hurdles to jump over with their particular clash, but I mean, to name names of something that I'm sure you noticed frustrated me with Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin sitting across from each other, and Ben saying, like, I won't come to your anniversary party because you're gay. And I think he said sin. I think he thinks it's a sin. But for whatever overtly religious reason he was pointing to, and then saying he wouldn't attend an interfaith marriage even if it's in his family. Like, okay, like these kind of things sitting across from you, you could be friends with him. It's fine. Like, I've actually never met Ben. I've met Dave a couple times, and he's lovely. Anything negative I say about Dave is not personal. He should know that if he ever happens to come across this. I interviewed him for the film, actually. It didn't make the cut. He's gracious enough to give me his time, all of that. But sitting across from someone who says that and then not doing the work to decide or to challenge that view and see who's right and who's wrong and get into it and still walk away as friends, like that, I think, is the hurdle to jump over. But as our also mutual friend Yasmin Muhammad pointed out, it's like what's unfortunate is in today's culture, that very low hurdle of just being friends or talking to someone you disagree with seems to be like this heroic act, because even that can get you in trouble, which is just a real shame of what's happening hopefully outside the walls of the dark web. But yeah, I'm in it for the higher hurdle.
I think it's almost a time and a place thing, and that's the thing with regards to, I mean, Dave can have his show be however he wants. Like, I want, for this particular episode, like, I don't want to be going into those things with you right now about my opinion of the Majid Sam thing that we talked about at the beginning, because we could have, but I'm like, oh, I have too much. I don't want to go, oh, my opinion on your opinion. Like that wasn't my aim for this.
Yeah.
We could, because like I do have a faith. Like I follow Jesus. So
Oh, do you? Okay.
yes,
Yeah.
I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've got my Christian degree, studies degree, and I also happen to follow him as well. But
Yeah.
but again, I'm fine to talk these things out, and I really do disagree with Ben Shapiro, by the way, about the way he went. But with Dave, I think that the way he wants his show to be, I don't think he wants a debate. I don't like. I'm not saying that it's okay. Then
I agree with you.
I think he has it set up to be light. I don't want to say light because that diminishes it, but like a nice chat.
Sam put it in very nice terms in one article when he started getting a lot of pushback of like, hey, you should be calling out Dave Rubin. And in very polite terms, he said Dave is experiencing the phenomenon of being captured by one's audience. I think that's a really, really diplomatic and lovely way to I think, and is probably a really good lesson for all of us in these kind of conversations. And I'm going to do some speculative thinking here and psychological thinking of what might be happening with Dave the same way Sam was. But I think it's fair to wonder if that's really where he found himself. And I do, as you know, have sympathy for Dave in this conversation. He did this very publicly. We have to remember that he was in a young...
I think.
I mean, this whole transition and sort of like waking up to the lunacy on the left was he was deep in it. He was on the Young Turks. That's about like the epicenter of sort of a lot of the craziness. Like he was deep into it. And he points to very specifically the Sam Harris with Ben Affleck on Bill Maher's show interview as the moment where he realized, oh, there's like a poison in the well here, and it's on my team. And it was a pretty rapid transition of him realizing that, and this is a really hard, I think maybe the hardest psychological truth, and maybe yes, we could bracket pushing on your Christianity if you want, but the hardest psychological truth I think to swallow generally is admitting that you've been duped by anything. And Dave realizing he'd been duped by the left and by a lot of this kind of thinking that he was really deep within, rightfully so, was like pissed and annoyed at it and went really fast out of it. Like, I'm sure thought this was like an epiphany of like, oh my God, the left is out of control, which it is. A lot of people have had this epiphany. And then started the show. His first guest was Sam, and like he's to his immense credit, because that was his avenue into these conversations, the Islam thing with Sam on Real Time. A lot of his first guests were ex-Muslims and Reform Muslims talking specifically about that issue and the betrayal of liberalism to the liberal-minded Muslims and ex-Muslims. He gave them a platform really when nobody else did, and he should get full credit for championing their cause and giving them this huge platform. But you know as well as I do, when you talk even about that subject in particular, no matter how careful you are, you will attract a certain crowd that hears a certain version of it and sees a certain version of it that, you know, just kind of likes hating on Muslims and brown people, and maybe that's really what they're attracted, or maybe they're Christian, so they think, yeah, these people just have the wrong God, and so I'm glad someone's finally saying here. Whatever they're attracted to, it's people who aren't really in it for the right reasons, or maybe just so angry at the left that they're willing to do anything and sacrifice all of their principles. I would say supporting Donald Trump would be that. Dave knew what was coming in some way intellectually. He even said he would be the first to hold Donald Trump's feet to the fire. I think he has a lot of trouble now criticizing Trump, but that speaks to just in 2 years of him doing that transition, attracting a very energetic crowd that was going like, hey, yeah, that's right. I'm glad someone's finally saying it. Here's a bunch of money on Patreon. Here's Dennis Prager and his money. Here's like a bunch of money coming your way and a bunch of attention coming your way. That's a place that can get you it's a lot of confirmation of what you're doing is the right thing. And it's very easy to see how you might get kind of stuck on the gutter on the other side of the road when you swerved out of the left one and you kind of got your your wheels caught in the right one, and it happened to be a very lucrative gutter for all kinds of reasons. And I hope Dave finds his way out of it, and I have a lot of sympathy for him in that position. And yes, and also we should remember Dave Rubin was a comedian. This guy doesn't have a PhD in philosophy. This intellectual part of the intellectual dark web that I keep pushing on, that's not an easy bar for anyone to do. And Dave, would he call himself an intellectual? I have no idea. He may have found himself in over his head intellectually with this stuff, and then getting
a platform for them.
And getting it, but then he puts his opinion out. So if you're an intellectual and you put your opinion out, like I'm doing a lot on this show, I expect it to be challenged, and I welcome that, and I hope I've done and I have the work to have the defenses. Like I said, if someone asks me why, I need an answer for that. That's hard work. So if Dave puts out an opinion and someone asks him why, and he's flustered or he finds that to be an attack or a criticism, anyway, it's a skill, like I said, that is not for everyone. Dave found himself in this position and maybe was a bit over his head intellectually, but I do hope he finds his way through it. I would love to sit down with him again, although I've tried and been rebuffed. I would love to sit down with him and just have, because I really do like the guy, and he does have an important platform. I think probably all of us, I don't know your experience with it, but the moment that we realized we were duped about anything, I guess it hasn't happened for you, but realizing you've been duped by your religion or your parents or the left or the right, the first month after that, you might find yourself sharing a lot of really stupid memes and being kind of angry. And, there's a lot of middle finger and kind of I told you so psychology, at least that happened for me.
Yes. Well, I have seen a lot of ex-Christians turned atheists, and they're the hardest of hardcore atheists.
But did they grow out of it after, I'm saying, I think there's a window where it's particularly aggressive.
Well, I don't know, actually. I've seen it on Twitter, and I'm guessing where they're at in their whatever. But okay, but I actually do have a bit of a kind of moment of realization for myself, but it might be different because it wasn't as foundation as say my faith, but it definitely almost was. But I wasn't as angry. I wasn't angry. I was just kind of this is cool. I decided that I always get criticized for saying the word believe. I understand the theory of evolution to be as true as it can that science can show us, because you don't believe in evolution because it's not a thing you believe in. So I've gotten criticized for saying I believe in evolution now, guys, on Twitter, but I do. So I mean, it was a long time coming. I decided that when I took a geology class in university, I think that there's an old Earth. It's not 6,000 years old, because that's ridiculous. I couldn't write my paper properly under the young Earth theory. So for a long time I've been okay, old Earth, that's fine. I don't know how to reconcile the evolution part. But then actually it was Jordan Peterson who helped me to make that leap, because of his biblical series. Funnily enough,
he's a good reformer for Christianity, I'll say that.
Well, it is. Well, a lot of people actually come back. I've heard a lot of I was far away, but I've come back to finding my meaning in my faith. I've heard that, but I'm the only person I know of who has believed in science more, or I subscribe to science more, but because of hearing him explain these early stories and how they coincide literally with the evolution of, say, our sight, seeing color, seeing snakes and snake patterns, whatever, like women and childbirth and the size of the head and pain being a result, whatever, there's a lot of things in the Genesis, particularly Adam and Eve's story, that is so, you can see the science in it, the way he describes it, that I was how, I'm it's true. It has to, whatever, it just clicked. But I wasn't upset about it, though. I was really quite happy about it, because I was oh, I understand something better now. And I can, I know the truth is what I kind of was happy to get. But again, I guess maybe it's not the same as the feeling duped, because I don't know, maybe it's not as foundational as the faith part, the sort of, I'm not a creationist anymore. And it was 10 years of, I don't think I'm an old Earth, or I am an old Earth person or whatever. So maybe it was a slower realization. and then I just made the last leap over with the evolution part. So I guess so I don't know. I don't know why that didn't make me angry at all. But again, maybe you can let me know if you think it's not the same thing.
I think there might be more leaps. I don't think you made the last leap. Is what I don't know if you'll be angry.
Like, for me, it's a leap though. Like it is.
Yeah. Maybe Jordan is landing that plane really softly. I don't know for you. I've no idea. I would do, like I hinted at it before. I'm really these days wondering if the atheist conversation and the new atheist energy, which has really dissipated to almost nothing. Like atheists aren't having debates with religious people anymore, publicly. The ones that are getting attention are all these different things. The Sam and Jordan one kind of was in a way, in foundational ways, but they didn't quite get there.
And Jordan Peterson is not a professed Christian anymore. Anyway, he's like he
calls himself.
He did, but I mean, he was my gateway drug into the IDW. So, yeah. and I've seen, and at least on 2 occasions, and someone asked him about it in the Q&A of his biblical lectures near the end. So this is as recent as I'd say last year. Like, do you believe that Jesus rose again from the dead, which is the crux of Christianity? Yeah. And he's like, I don't know.
Yeah, he gives these answers like, I don't know. Which for me is wild and should be he would hate it, but should be laughed at, because you know what the person is asking, and he pretends that they don't. But I think I know what he. I mean, I don't want to put too many words in his mouth, but I do think this conversation matters, and I don't need to try to do like an intervention or get into it with you. But I do think it actually matters, and it matters to a lot of the IDW energy. If Jordan is part of it and willing to do the work, and I know he's willing to go here, his bottom, and the reason he says I don't know is because he's said things like atheism will kill you. And I think I know what he means by that. He means, again, to go back to what we were talking about before, that I don't want to this is skipping over too much that probably needs the groundwork, but at the bottom of a lot of these deep philosophical questions that Jordan and Sam were swirling around, and I think that you're alluding to there with that, is this question of do humans need a bullshit story or a fantastical story, or do they need to believe in the fact claims of a story that maybe at its base is metaphorical, if that makes sense, in order to, in his version, pragmatically
find meaning, I guess, and live a virtuous life, I guess.
Find truth using his definition of truth, meaning pragmatic, that if it's useful, it's true. So it's useful to believe in these fictions, and so they're true.
Right? What does that mean? What does that mean?
It's a pragmatic way to say that there's truth in it, but he has, at least when you push him on it, say he'll make factual truth versus, Brett Weinstein tried to say metaphorically true. He's tried to split the hairs and admit that there is a truth that's adjudicated by the evidence of the universe that is separate than the truth that he's talking about. And when you're talking about evolution, you're talking about a truth that is adjudicated by the evidence of the universe. You're not talking about metaphorical truth. But does only relying on the truth adjudicated by the evidence of the universe, does that allow you to build a civilization? And he doubts that it does. Sam thinks, we should certainly try. And I think that's why he answers that question with I don't know. Because he rather worries about popping that balloon for people. I don't worry about it. I think we have to pop those balloons. And then that's where the fun work actually begins, of trying to be human and actually being in the universe. So
he's worried about the balloon being popped in Soviet Russia, communist China.
Yeah, exactly. That's what he sees. Yeah, I think so. I think that's where he goes, which is a pessimism about human nature that's quite interesting. Where at the bottom of it, which maybe he's right. Again, it's like an open question. The optimistic view that can we actually live in this universe? Can we actually find meaning in this universe? This one is kind of the Sam Harris atheist approach. And the answer of no, we actually can't. We need a story that is outside of this universe, beyond this universe. We need that to function. Is the pessimistic view, and that's the religious view.
Okay, I do actually have something about this, because I just made a video a few videos ago about, actually was critiquing Ben Shapiro's Judeo-Christian read on
hate that
civilization. So, because I literally have like a degree in this, so again, I kind of came to the conclusion that you can't say it's Judeo-Christian, which is a new word, phrase, thing anyway. It's a cultural context that you actually look at, and yes, Christendom was part of the context, but so were their Englishness or Frenchness or Germanness, or there's a lot of things, all these factors. You can't just point to one, ingredients of a cake, right? It's all of it working together. And some, even with the Christianity part, people pushing against it. But you had to have the equal and opposite reaction thing, right? You need to have all parts. You can't take one away, because they all put forward the Enlightenment, whatever. So I'm kind of going the historical context. You can't look at only one thing. You've got to look at the whole to understand it. But I was chatting back and forth a bit with a professor friend of mine, who's a political philosophy professor, and he's writing his PhD right now. And I'm going to, when he's like, I need to finish this dissertation. So hopefully in May, I'll be able to chat with him. But he is writing his dissertation, I think, on Aristotle, and about why in the world in his writings would he include the gods? Because he references the gods, but he was kind of whatever the Greeks' version of an atheist. And so this was a conversation, and I don't want to be like, so what his conclusion for his dissertation is like, I don't know that I've gotten it correct, but from what I understand, the whole thing is, well, there must have been some utility in it. Like, there must have been a need for it, even though he himself, Aristotle, didn't need that, but the people needed it. Yeah. There's it was needed, and whether or not Aristotle found those things to be useful for himself, or just included it in his writings for the people as well. And again, so this professor friend, he was telling me about, because I asked him for help understanding this sort of secular Christian thing, push and pull. So he was the one who came up with it, so I used it in my video a bit, like the sort of the mythos versus logos, and then the sort of dichotomy between the push and the pull, and then human beings live somewhere in the middle, and that we always have, and that it's the wrestling between the two that kind of makes us who we are. And but I mean, you might be like, no, let's just throw the one out. We only need logos in the, logic part. Like, we only need the reason part. We don't need the mythos part, but seems like we do, Jay. Yeah. Seems like we do.
No, so this is what I would advocate for in my pushback on people like Ben or Jordan, is they're fetid for one particular story from one particular epic, namely the Jesus story. I'm totally fine with stories and storytelling. I think we do need that. I think there's huge utility in that, and it's how we function. So, yeah, I'll reference. I'm working on a new podcast project. Actually, I've been recording a lot of interviews for it, and I did this interview that will be part of a show with this amazing guy named Eric Kaplan, who is a PhD in philosophy from Berkeley and a few other awesome degrees, but better known for being the executive producer of The Big Bang Theory, and he wrote Futurama and Flight of the Conchords. Like, really, really amazing, interesting guy. We had this great conversation actually about Star Trek, so I could tell you about the project later.
I love Star Trek. I love it. I want to know about it
later. I could spill the beans. But after sort of our big philosophical discussion about a particular Star Trek thing, I asked him about his storytelling kind of efforts. Obviously, he's a prominent storyteller of our time, and he had this great line where he said, stories are a pretty good way for humans to deal with trauma. And he said one of the signs that someone has a trauma that they haven't made sense of yet is they don't have a story about it. I think it was brilliant. And it was like, he was like, if someone gets in a car accident or something and they're like, and you ask them what happened, and they're like, well, there I was, and headlights, and then blood, and this, and it's sort of just this incoherent memories kind of coming in. Or they have a different way of talking about it of like, well, I'm the kind of person who does this, and there was a rainy night, and then this kind of thing happened, and that one's a theory. So one's a theory, and one's just sort of, he called it like a cry of pain. And until they have a story about it of like the beginning, middle, and end, and here's a story, they haven't really made sense of it, which is sort of brilliant. And then it was like, and in some ways, the trauma of being in a universe without asking to be here, without any apparent rule book, in this where death is apparently a real thing, is kind of a trauma that we all face, a very slow trauma, but we're all in that trauma. And big stories about that trauma are religion. And that's what that does, to try to make sense of this trauma that we're all going through. And then, of course, I asked him, and is it possible that certain stories lead to better outcomes than other stories? And that's, where he was able to admit then, of course, that some stories are more harmful than other stories. And that, I think that's not going to go away. I think there's huge utility in that, psychological utility in that, probably collective utility in that, meaning-making utility in that, all kinds of utility. And it's sort of beautiful and lovely. It's how, like, we teach our young and all this kind of stuff. But what's really, really important, I think, about those stories is that those stories are stories about the actual trauma that we're in. And okay, scientists we just looked at this like black hole, billions of 55 million light years away, right? It's fucking incredible photo that we all saw. In this kind of framework, that's people looking at like the bruises of the trauma that we all go through, of just like, we're trying to figure this fucking trauma out that we're all in. We're like in a huge car accident all the time trying to figure it out. All the pieces of this crazy, it's like we're detectives who came across a crazy, awful murder called life, and we're forensically trying to put it together piece by piece, and it's the craziest story that's out there and a lot of it's really beautiful. We're trying to figure out what's going on, and that's the effort of science. And we should always be telling stories about that trauma, namely religion. That's great. But when we learn something new, and those are hard-fought pieces of knowledge that we learn, when a new piece comes along, or a theory that we had turns out to not be right because, this is a better model, and there's so much mystery out there. Well, it's important that we tell different stories. And I know you've alluded a lot to the efforts of Christianity to warp their story to try to fit that. I mean, when Galileo said, hey guys, I'm pretty sure the sun's in the middle, not the earth, it wasn't like they snapped their fingers and they're like, oh yeah, that's what the book says. It was like, we're going to cut off your fucking head and put you in jail and make sure you don't tell anyone that. And it took hundreds and hundreds of years and a lot of death and a lot of pain before Christianity was like, okay, I think that fits actually. Here we go. Like, it's it's not like overnight these things work. And eventually some of these stories warp so far that they break. And like all the other stories in history, almost all of them are in the dustbin of history of crazy religions that have existed that we sort of don't take seriously now. All of the ones that we're talking about now will likely go away. And to sort of Jordan Peterson's points, certainly a lot of the details of them will resurface or survive, because a lot of this trauma is eternal. A lot of this trauma, death being a real thing, well, as long as that's a real thing, that's an open question for science as well. With death being a real thing, like that will always manifest itself somehow in these kind of hero stories that he talks about and stuff. And it's important work that he does, but it's important not to be too attached to the fetish of one particular story, because we have to admit the best stories are stories about the trauma we actually find ourselves in, and figuring out what that trauma is, broadly speaking, is the enterprise of science. And that's like a beautiful, religion and science coexist in that dynamic to me, where religion must be downstream of science rather than the other way around. If it's not, you get the horror show of like what happened to Galileo. If religion precedes science, like you can only look for this and find this piece of information because our story says so, we're doing it wrong. But to that point, religion is globally really under strain, probably like it's never been. I mean, because we're finding out so much about the trauma at such a rapid pace, just given quantum mechanics 100 years ago, like, wasn't even a thing. Like, the apple cart's being overturned pretty frequently about a lot of, like, the details that I think the stories and reforming the stories is really having trouble keeping up, probably rightfully so. So we might be finding ourselves in a Yuval Harari in his recent book pointed to this moment that we've lost all of our stories. Our like he said that, went from many to two to one.
Did he write the Humans or something?
He wrote Sapiens, then Homo Deus.
I'm like, humans, right? No,
yeah,
Sapiens.
And then Homo Deus, and then his recent one is 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And if I remember it correctly, everyone always tries to label the age that we're in, right? I've heard the age of anger is a book that I know. Everyone tries to name the age, and he basically tries it at the beginning of that book and defines it that way, that this is the age where we've lost, he calls it the age of bewilderment, that we've lost all of our stories. And I think that's
sad.
It's
Isn't that sad?
No, but it's sad, but it's also this huge opportunity of, like, well, and it's really hard. How do you tell a good story that captures people's imaginations, that has rituals and songs and buildings and art and can survive millennia and do all this kind of stuff that admittedly is really important to do for these stories, that actually somehow incorporates the fact that there's a black hole 55 million light years away that we don't fucking understand, and that quantum mechanics is just totally wild, and there's things like quantum entanglement that seems spooky, but of course we have a model for it. Like, and the fact
figured out quantum gravity, so
we do, the dark matter, dark energies out there. But we do know what's hard also for religions is we also know, and we didn't really need science to tell us this, but that the religious notion of a soul with something called like libertarian free will just must be an incoherent concept for this particular universe. So that's one that I have trouble fitting almost any religious philosophy in and calling it a good story. Buddhism gets close. Robert Wright wrote this book called Why Buddhism is True that makes a lot of these points. But the Judeo-Christian stories or the Abrahamic stories, I find myself having a really hard time calling them good or accurate or sturdy stories given the knowledge of the soul and the afterlife being a coherent concept by any measure. So yeah, that's my deep dive on the religious take and where I take issue with Jordan, but I don't take issue with his pessimism that it might be necessary. I just want better stories. There you go.
So we lost my video because my battery was dying and I had to plug in my Mac. But anyway, so back to, okay, where are we? So we're just like figuring out the universe and what makes sense. But these are the kind of, this was a little bit of an example, I'd say, that we accidentally did of IDW protocol. Actually, no, we didn't even do any of the steps, but the I part, like the intellectual, like, let's do some digging, and we have different points of view, and let's not be hostile, but let's present our perspectives, right? Like, that's kind of, is that what
I would hope so. Yeah, like if, I guess let's use abortion again as because it is such a good one. If two people, like, okay, so we all know what disagreements on abortion look like on CNN or on any mainstream news, and people are certainly fed up with that because that's, here's my opinion, you're the devil, no, you're the devil, end of the story.
Yeah. Nothing gets, you watched that bit with my interview with Ryan. How, did you hear, did I mention about how I have moved my position, not because I feel like I should morally, but because I want change. So did I say
you moved your position because you want change?
I was pro, okay, maybe I didn't mention that. So I am pro-life, but I would, if I had to say, in Canada, it's actually like you can do third term abortion and it's been like that for a while. But if I was, say, going to vote, like, say, tomorrow on limits, I would probably say, like, you're allowed to take Plan B or get whatever the strongest version of I guess, like a chemical or oral. You take like a pill or whatever, short of like
there's
an operation.
B, and then there's like an insert that basically forces like a period pretty much.
Yeah.
Like,
so that, but like a non-operational, non-surgical.
You would vote. Can we do like a little IDW-ish thing? Because like I could tell you how like I want it to sound whether we get there or not. But because yes, it's easy for me to say like I disagree with you, which I do, like just on the outside, but that's boring. It's like why do I disagree with that? And it's trying to get below the surface of our disagreement of how. I mean, in my view, the intellectual part would demand how are you modeling your moral judgment there, or even legal one, but moral first, because legality should follow morality in a perfect world. How are you modeling your moral world there? I could just ask you. Usually people say stuff like, well, I think life just, we have to draw a line and it's like the third trimester or something, but like where are you drawing it versus where am I drawing it, and why does that matter? And then is it possible, what is there information that could make me right or make you wrong, etc.? Like I could complicate it for you. But I think that's the whole point of the intellectual dark web is like, let's complicate it, because abortion is really, really tricky, and the moral issues around it are incredibly tricky.
Remember how like when I brought up abortion with Ryan and he said, well, let's not, it's not about abortion, it's when does life begin? Yeah,
but that's even a really, I mean, if that's the line for you is when does life begin, I actually think that's a red herring in the abortion debate, because you could tell me life begins at conception. And then I could ask you, well, what's your definition of life? And I presume you could give me some sort of, I don't know, potential or something, and we could go there. And then but all that establishes is that you're killing something, and then there's the question of consciousness. Is it having a conscious experience, which is a different question than life, I would say, or do you not think so? And what is your model or your intuition of consciousness? And does this matter to you? Because I think without consciousness, there's no moral question at all. If something has no consciousness, we don't need to worry about it. I don't need to worry about this bottle, presuming it has no conscious. But if there was a monkey next to me, I grant it some consciousness, and it has some. So is it a consciousness thing? But even if you do all of that, and you give me all of that, and we can establish that by your definitions, and if you are right about those questions, because those questions are open at the moment, not scientific yet, and they're philosophical, certainly, although we could probably make some logical inferences about them. We would only be able to establish that if the conditions were right, it is taking of a life. And like it would get us that far. But even that doesn't get us very far, because we take lives all the time under all kinds of conditions. Because then it's like we take lives I don't know if you believe in capital punishment, or if you would
I don't actually.
Okay.
Which is rare, by the way, for a pro-life person, but
I presume you would take a life in certain circumstances that I could easily imagine of, like, would you
self-defense, for example.
Self-defense, you would take a life, or would you drop a bomb on a terrorist who has his innocent daughter in the backseat because he's driving a bus full of explosives into a wedding and he's going to kill 5,000 people? Maybe you pull the trigger there and kill him.
So we're just doing the trolley problem here.
I can mess it up with all kinds of trolley problems, but I can get. Yeah. But even that one, that's a simple one. There's a terrorist. He's driving a car full of explosives into a wedding party. He's going to kill 1,000 people at it. You have every reason to believe that this is what's happening. You're about to press the button that sends a rocket and kills him and blows up the car. And at the last moment, you notice his 5-year-old daughter's in the back seat. Do you still press the button?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I mean, I presume you
do I have to be the one? Can I just nod at someone and they press it?
You don't have to be the one who does the abortion either, so you know where this is going. So yeah, would you approve of someone who did it?
This is so hard.
No, but come on, this one shouldn't actually be hard.
No, it's one of those. What if the bomb malfunctioned and it didn't go off in the end? You know, okay. That's.
You can factor that in.
Okay, well
there's 1,000 people at the wedding party, presumably tons of 5-year-old girls there as well. So
I call in the sniper team who is in the helicopter above.
You can't get out of it. This is the last minute.
Okay, fine. Yes, probably. Okay. Yeah.
So in that, this hasn't answered the question yet, but in that circumstance, you're like, okay, I admit that I'm killing a life in this circumstance. And I don't blame you. I think that's the moral decision is to unfortunately, she's collateral damage in that situation, unfortunately. And hopefully we would have, yes, a sniper that could get us out of it. But given those conditions, you were like, yes, I will take a life. So even the tenet It's called deontological rule in philosophy. A deontological
Intro to philosophy,
good.
Sir.
Well, for the people out there who don't know, a deontological rule, this is not one for you, and there's certain exceptions for it, and it's more of a consequential argument. And then we're stuck with, in the abortion case, okay, does the variable that life happens to literally be entirely encompassed in another human life, namely the mother, is that a variable that is equivalent in any way that you will take this life? And is it collateral damage of the universe, of the situation, of this woman and her thing? In the case of rape and incest, I don't know how you answer it. Most pro-lifers make an exception for rape and incest.
Which is,
I would make an exception for if the mother will die, or the rape and incest thing, yeah, I guess I don't even like thinking about that, but honestly, but yeah, sure. In the case, I'm thinking of the ones where it's third term. The mother wanted to hold on as long as possible, just in case, but she's gonna die. For me, I have 3 kids. If I was pregnant, and I would leave not only my husband wifeless, but my other 2 kids motherless.
Sure.
And like their baby's gonna die anyway after 5 hours of being out.
But even if it's, I know
those are the easy cases. I'm trying to get you like.
But some pro-life are like not even that. Well, I mean, like, but and a lot of pro-choice people give those examples though, which is, I think, unfair. I'm talking birth control, like that, using it as birth control, like an abortion, because you're a 18-year-old, 16-year-old silly girl who...
So exactly. This is where I think, because I've been trying to... I think you hit it there. I've been trying to help...
Birth control!
Just wait. It hasn't happened for me yet. I've never tangled with a pro-life person who at the bottom of their moral structure, it was about the baby. It's about the mother. And I think the better argument for them, I honestly think the better argument for the pro-lifers, I'm trying to help you clarify, if it's true, clarify what I think your actual moral stance on abortion is, and it's not about the baby. I'm so tired of the pro-lifers talking about the baby. They don't give a fuck about the baby. They care about the woman. They care... I don't think you do. In rape and incest, this has nothing to do with the baby, but you would make an exception and say this woman should kill this life because why?
I almost wouldn't want to. I think medically is more compelling, to be honest. To me. But
the rape and incest one, do you make an exception? I think Ben does as well.
I know this sounds okay. This sounds kind of... I haven't really thought about that one. I've thought about the medical one. The medical, like, if the mother will die.
That's sort of an easy one, because that trolley problem is taken care of.
Well, see, like, I grew up with, no, you don't abort the baby. Like, that's what I grew up with.
I'm glad you made that step at least then. But in the rape and incest case, because this is a case.
Well, I kind of think that, like, it's not the baby's fault, and that sucks. And that one, I don't know. I guess it would be like sort of a case. Why can't you just like put it up for adoption?
You're forcing this, so you're going to force the woman to go through childbirth and 9 months of labor and a painful childbirth.
Okay, no. Okay, actually, this is why this is actually explaining why. Can you please? This is why I have moved my position from like, and I do call myself still pro-life, but many probably would be like Dave Rubin's like begrudgingly pro-choice. Like, I suppose that's...
I can't believe he's being convinced of that. I don't think he's doing the work, but this is the work.
Right? I don't know. I think I call myself ideally pro-life, but if pushed, because again, I want change, and I want women not being completely like railroaded, and I also want babies to live. Get it done within the first 13, 14, 12 weeks. Like, see, like that's... I do care. And I'm like, no, sir. I do care about the baby. I don't want the baby feeling pain. Okay? That's what I'm talking about. Like if you don't want animals to suffer, like, yes, we could put animals down, but we don't want them suffering, right? So I don't want the what you would say fetus, what I would say baby. At some point, their nerves are developed. They can feel themselves being decapitated.
So now
you're getting into the consciousness question, which is the bottom of all of
So
moral.
this is my whether regardless of the rape incest, I suppose no, but that's sort of the exception that you're bringing up. So I guess that got me there.
legit exception because this is like
Why should you make an exception if it's rape or incest if you're truly pro-life? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So that's
No.
why
If it's truly about the baby, why should you make? If the baby's a separate entity and it has its own pain and its own consciousness and its own life, why should you make an exception for rape and incest? It's a very easy answer that I feel like pro-lifers are afraid to admit what they're doing there. If you make the exception for rape and incest, you are admitting that this moral framework, which isn't even a bad one, so I don't know why pro-lifers are afraid to do it, because we haven't even actually started talking about the differences between us. I'm still just trying to convince you, I think, of what your actual argument is. If you make an exception for rape and incest, or even if you feel that intuition of it, the intuition that's much stronger for you is responsibility of the mothers. The fact that you're saying just get it done in the first 14 weeks.
But I don't want the baby feeling that pain. And some people say, no, the baby doesn't feel pain up until birth? What?
I think all of those conversations are totally beside the point. I don't think this is about the baby for you, and I don't think it's about the baby for them. This is about the mother.
Literally, my reason why for having it done early is before, say, like, that feeling is developed of the pain of what, or that, getting like that salt solution, like burning it to death or whatever, or whatever. Like, I don't want it feeling that.
Keep in mind, you gave a lot of pain to the little girl in the back seat with the terrorist.
So that was a bomb, okay? That was instant.
So the bomb in the equivalence here would be something as terrible as a rape or incest pregnancy. And is the pain of this unborn baby, using your terminology, the collateral damage of this awful bomb of the universe that went off in the mother's life, and now she's dealing with it. I don't know why pro-lifers just don't say that actions, and I think at the bottom of it, it's a religious view. I really do, and I think it's probably a Christian view.
Because of the intrinsic value of life, right?
No, the intrinsic value of responsibility. I honestly think the instinct is the mother's, because if you make the exception of rape and incest, this is a situation that very cleanly removes the variable of an irresponsible mother. You're literally saying it was not her fault. She was raped, or it's a father or some family member. It was some awful situation. And so we're going to remove it. And with the incest one, we also have to do some tests and say it's also not going to be like a disabled baby or something. But remove all those variables. Yeah. Remove all the variables, and you have a very clean. In one situation, it's someone who had sex unprotected, or even with protection that broke, and they took the risk or whatever, and then they're left with these consequences. A world without consequences for one's actions, I think, is honestly the intuition that is happening at the base of the pro-life argument, which frankly is not a bad argument, but is a different argument than I care about the baby.
But I think that it's the incest one I've not thought of, but that's why I kind of was like, okay, I guess I have thought about the rape part, and I think that I have thought, but it's not that baby's fault that it's. But like the fact that
in any of them, it's never the baby's fault.
Okay, but the fact that I have shifted my position to the point where you can still choose to not bear into this world a child, but I don't want it to be so far developed that it suffers whilst being removed from this world. That's not about the baby at all, you think? The suffering of the baby, like in my position moving because I don't want the baby suffering?
No, that's concern for the baby, and to do it in as humane a way as possible. And then you're just stuck with the variable of being born into a world that doesn't want it, namely the mother who doesn't want to take care of it. Okay, so, like the forced adoption. Then you're just playing with those variables of that you don't want it to suffer. But that line is going to become a consciousness line, and that's fine if you think that line is drawable.
Okay, let's go. Okay, so we've been defining the terms here for a while. Okay, so I think this is defining the terms. It's really consciousness, and I suppose for me that's when you can feel pain. Like, isn't that all of us suffering?
when you could feel pain. Well, I mean, this is a whole other conversation that we probably don't have 2 hours to go into, but the consciousness question is, I mean, it's actually the thing that's most interesting to me in all of philosophy, because it's the grounding of, I think, all moral frameworks. But when something has consciousness is a very, it's literally like, you know, an entire subject. The problem of other minds already exists. But yes, we should probably grant the baby consciousness at some point. But is it the kind of consciousness that makes a moral claim on us? For me, it doesn't outweigh the claim that the mother is making on us.
Where do you stand? Do you think that like up until, you know, like labor, like of a 9-month?
I honestly, like, it's hard for me to find a line this is like a very Peter Singer thing when he got in trouble with like euthanasia stuff. But for me, it's hard to find a line that, you know, up until pretty much labor. Like it's a life for me. The variable, like I said, the variable that this life is a special case, the same way the kid in the backseat with the terrorist was a special case, obviously. The special case that this is a human life that is entirely inside of another human life is a variable that is monumental enough in my moral framework, which I could try to go into why, but monumental enough that the autonomy and a principle of autonomy for the life that happens to be literally outside of the other life has full control over, full decision making over. And the line that I just would have to draw, but would just be birth, I guess, would be the day of birth. Like I really don't care. We take lives all the time because of variables. And that variable for me is just like monumental.
So even like the fact that technology has developed so that life can very much live outside of the womb.
And that's what I'm frankly worried about with Roe v. Wade. And I'm quite concerned actually after the Kavanaugh thing that a lot of the feminist movement, or let's say even the pro-choice movement, I'll get the word feminist because it's complicated at the moment, but the pro-choice movement is a little too obsessed with Roe v. Wade and thinking that it's this ultimate protection. Everything that you just said, there is a rape and incest exception for it, and it's entirely dependent on the language of viability outside of the womb, entirely dependent on that language. And at the time it was written, 76 or whatever.
You couldn't go past whatever.
They did it in trimesters, which is a pretty arbitrary line anyway. And it was like first trimester is fine, second trimester only, and made the same exception that you did, that if the mother's life is in danger, you could get it all the way to the third. You literally in your position, again, we didn't even disagree. Like, I'm still just trying to like frame the argument, but I mean, we do disagree, but we actually
you kind of did though at the end.
We definitely disagree, but like we didn't get, so like I don't think we did the like dive into like who might be right.
We didn't do the steel manning of each other's position either.
I'm trying to like, because I'm frankly trying to steel man your position. I think I am, but I'm trying to improve it because it's not consistent the way that pro-lifers I think it is. But anyway, what you outlined is entirely Roe v. Wade, and Roe v. Wade is depends entirely on the language of the viability of the baby outside the womb. And as you were saying, with technology, what I worry about is the line of viability, where when the time it was written was sort of first trimester into second trimester-ish is what they wrote in the law. That's a one-way street that's only going closer towards conception. So if I'm Mississippi and Kavanaugh's on the bench now, I pass a law that basically bans abortion after like the second week or something. And of course it'll be challenged in the constitutionality and it'll get up to the Supreme Court. And my line is, everyone's all worried like Roe v. Wade's going to be overturned. Roe v. Wade doesn't need to be overturned. If I'm the attorney for the state of Mississippi trying to defend that law, I say, no, judges, you don't have to overturn Roe v. Wade. You're following Roe v. Wade. We're going by the viability test. It just so happens that because of technology, the viability is now at like 2 or 3 weeks, because look at this amazing technology. You can uphold our law. So I'm terrified for women and for the pro-choice movement of thinking that Roe v. Wade is a law or a precedent that protects them and their choice. And it is not a law about women. It is a law about babies. And that's where I'm trying to like outline the mistake here. It doesn't protect women. This is not like a pro-women law, and I rather worry about it. For me, it's one way or the other. If it's murder, the rape and incest thing makes no sense because, as you just said, it's never the baby's fault that it happened to be conceived.
Right.
And if honestly, I have the people who are who bite the philosophical bullet and are consistent with making no exception for rape and incest and saying it's murder all the time. They're actually, frankly, harder to contend with because then you're just stuck with this. You're stuck with this consciousness question and pain question and autonomy question. And then I'm stuck. And not stuck, I think that's the right argument, but arguing the variable that a life inside of another life is enough of a variable that, we take lives all the time, and this one clearly passes the bar for me. But that's a harder argument.
The reason why you take a life also matters. Inconvenience being one of the things that is not even inconvenience. Like, how can I throw my life away? Like that's I think what. That's a big deal for us.
Taking a life should always be a big deal. Always be a big deal. Yes, absolutely.
Like you saw how much I waffled with taking that 5-year-old girl's life.
I know.
But if you don't, that wedding party is going to be blown up.
If you don't have this abortion,
yeah,
what? Your life is going to be different than you thought.
Yeah, and it could be quite different for the baby. I mean, this is just
it's not
again,
so simple.
adoption.
Okay, I mean, if it's like, but that's not so simple either, And maybe the kid is gonna have a shitty life. Adoption's not always so great. Like this is not always, and also, maybe my travel in sub-Saharan Africa to like reference something from the early part of the conversation, plays a significant role in my rather firm pro-choice because I see the horror show of children being born into worlds where it's just needless suffering on the outside.
Okay. Well, maybe my perspective here, because it's here that it's being talked about so much, right?
And it's not. It's certainly not. The coat hanger is very alive and well in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's fucking terrible. Because of course, I mean, these are strong Christian countries that, it's you're certainly not allowed to have an abortion there. But maybe that colors my view a little bit. But it's certainly a complicated matter. But just noticing the intuition changes when you throw rape into the question for me, is perfectly clarifying because most people make that exception. I think even including Ben Shapiro makes that exception, and it's just crystallizingly clear to me at that point and it should be to them too, that the argument is about the fault of the pregnancy and not allowing a trapdoor to get out of a pregnancy and using abortion as birth control. And then you're a totally different moral conversation and a legitimate one. Like I'm not trying to like pull the fuse out of the abortion.
Well, because you said responsibility, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, the difference between a pregnancy that happens because of a rape and a pregnancy that happens because of forgetting to use protection or being irresponsible about using protection is crystal clear. The only variable there is one is clearly not the fault of the woman, and the other one you could say, well, you took the chance, and so you're stuck with it.
Right.
And we've never even invoked God in this situation either, which is interesting to have the entire abortion debate without invoking God, which is true. But I would contend when you get to the bottom, if I'm right, that most pro-life arguments are actually about cosmic responsibility for our choices and a structure like that needs to be in place somehow. Then I do think you end up in sort of religiously grounded arguments about punishment. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. That it's about the punishment and responsibility versus, say, the sacredness of life. But I think I can see your where you're going with it. But if you don't, I'm just trying to think. I felt like I've moved, right? Mm-hmm. My position because I want change.
Because you want change, yeah.
I want change because pro-lifers are like never know. Apparently, except for the exception that you mentioned, that I didn't even really think about. But no one's moving in this debate, and I thought that maybe we could end up meeting with laws in the middle, 20 weeks or something. Even though I wouldn't even go over to 20 weeks.
Yeah, I want to get. This is actually great. I mean, this is fascinating, and I want to borrow again. I mentioned him earlier, but David Deutsch is just like my favorite thinker, and he changed my mind rather drastically in his last book, The Beginning of Infinity. About it's going to sound crazy, but the concept of compromise.
Compromise. That's exactly what I'm. Oh, you're going to go against it. Okay.
Can I challenge it for you? Yeah. I mean, sure. And this is actually a particular. I'll shift the example. We've talked about abortion a lot. I'll shift the example on the table. I'll come up with something else just to clean it up. But yeah, he goes after compromise in this really fascinating way that it was sort of took me aback on the page, and I was like, man, it's really good. But let's say there's problem X. It's a moral problem or a legal problem. We're in society dealing with it. Problem X is over here, and you have an idea to solve it. We'll call it solution A, and I have an idea to solve it. It's called solution B, and we disagree. These solutions are non-congruent, not a lot of overlap here, and we fight it out, and then we decide, let's just compromise somewhere in the middle. We'll call that one solution C, and we apply that to X. Well, what you've done in the end is literally nobody has ever said that C will solve X. I said A would solve X, or whatever I said, you said B would solve X. No one ever said C would solve X, and now we're trying C to solve X. And when it fails, it's like, no fucking wonder it failed, because we didn't try A or B. And in some ways, he's making an argument. I'll give you some concrete examples of why this certain X's. This is crystal clear. He brings it up in an argument almost in favor of something like the Electoral College, of like a winner take all system, being like, well, A won the election, so we're trying A. And if that doesn't work, then, hopefully there's error correcting mechanisms and B will win next time and B will try it, rather than this like weird C thing. On certain questions, certainly meeting somewhere in the middle, and C probably you learn something about X, like something like the tax code. You're trying to sort of do it here with abortion. That's why I want to switch it. Like, although we should put abortion aside. If it's something like the tax code and you say it should be at 10% and I say 7 and we try 8.5 or whatever, that's probably a solution that maybe we learned something by doing this.
That's an in-between one that seems more in between than like the abortion debate.
Yeah,
so I can
exactly. Exactly. Because the abortion one, I think it's a consciousness one that's quite complicated and different. But if it's something like that, maybe we learn something there. But if it's something like gay marriage, should gay marriage be legal or not? And you say yes and I say no. Well, what's like the compromise of that? Like, well, we'll let them get like half married, or like, we'll let like 20% of them get married and we'll just flip a coin. Like
the compromise is ridiculous. It's either
okay,
moral.
but wait, I have a question.
Yeah.
And which is kind of what I think many libertarians would say. You say yes and no. Yes, like in a civil way, and no to forcing pastors or people in religious faiths to marry them.
Fine. I'm just saying, even like, yeah.
But isn't that in between? Is that not in between?
I mean, the question on the table I was saying was just like, should we legalize it? Should we allow people to get married, period? Yeah, if you want to go into the details of forcing who has to do the ceremony or whatnot, maybe it gets...
Because you do force the civil servants to do the ceremony in a way, but not in the religious... So, doesn't what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, kind of a compromise there, but I would also argue that, this is going to get to the moral realism thing there. This notion, actually, Sam says it at the beginning of the film, this notion of agree to disagree is oftentimes really kind of silly. Like, what does it mean to agree to disagree about should gay people get married? I think the line he used in the film was like, very often you're talking about human freedom and life and death very quickly on a lot of these subjects. Like, what does it mean to agree to disagree about forced hijab wearing, or about gay marriage, or even about abortion? Like, very soon you're disagreeing about things that are really consequential in the universe. This is going to go, like, it's hard to get away from when you do these intellectual conversations. You're always, in my view, circling the drain of moral notions of objective secular morality without invoking God and without subjectivism.
See, there's no politics in this, though, because that's why you're saying, by politics, I mean speaking in a politician's sort of way. Like Sam, you said Sam doesn't do that because he's not a politician, and the compromise is a very political thing versus philosophically. It sounds like you're saying there's not really much room for that.
I think people change their mind, and maybe you even did this or you're sliding on abortion or something. Like, I think people, like, I don't see how I could be wrong about this, but perhaps I am. Political positions are like above. It's like they're the, well, I'll do the reverse. They're like the puppets, but the strings in the marionette is the moral structures that are above it in that analogy, that are really behind it and how you're building your moral structures, which is why I think the religion question still really matters. But I'm guessing, like most people, even if when I change my mind, it's not engaged in a political fight with someone on a political level, but it's like, it's the why do you think that, which if you're doing it right is at a deeper level of like a philosophical groundwork. And if I find I have I might be totally wrong about abortion, and if I find that I have philosophical grounding that is inconsistent or unfounded, that's what emerges from that. The emergent properties of philosophical bedrock is politics. So like political conversations to me at that level are sort of boring about who's right or wrong politically. It's like, why are you right or wrong politically at that deeper level is really, I mean, I think that's where the real show is. And the people who are willing to go there, I hope, are the people who are willing to, who love the IDW for what it could be and should be, and get into those weeds. So,
well, and that's why, yeah, because we would have, if we really wanted to do the IDW protocol, we would have had to have another few hours, because it does take a lot. Well, even for me to think about why, I'm like, okay, why? I think that I changed my mind because I want to change, and I thought someone had to move, but that's not really why. Ultimately, what it is I want the least amount of babies who can feel suffering to feel suffering. Like that's what it is. It's minimizing suffering.
But if I can confuse that for you, then it like becomes, I mean, that's what moral philosophy is all about. Like coming out with that sentence as some sort of tenet, you want it to be morally consistent. When you play with the variables in the classic sort of trolley problem, playing with the variable stuff, and you find an inconsistency, that's always illuminative of finding why is that case different than another case. So that's why I brought up the terrorism one. But I didn't even give you, like, I don't even know if I have it. But if I'm really going to do the work of defending my position, why is the variable that one human life is entirely inside of another human life? Why is that enough for me? Well, I alluded to it briefly, like some sort of principle of autonomy. But yeah, we have to talk for like hours about why that is even a thing. Where am I getting that from? At the bottom of it, you're always going to hit David Hume's is and ought, honestly, that distinction. And that's where Sam and Jordan hit. And very firmly, Jordan is like, you cannot get an ought from an is, and Sam says, I think you can. I think there's always, and to Jordan's credit, logically you can't. And I admit that, even though I badly want to get an ought from an is. Logically you can't, but to do anything in civilization, we must. And so how are you making that first step from the is to the ought? For me, like whenever I'm engaged with someone who's really willing to do the work, like you clearly are, about these kind of conversations, like I always want to know that ground of like, how do you start moving from the is to the ought? What is it?
Well, that's the tension that the logos mythos tension that I was talking about. That's where I think we live.
You need to build some myth across the bridge. I could do it for you if I had like, another half an hour, because I use Carl Sagan to do it, and I've developed my own sort of mythos that lets me get from the is to the ought, and then I can start building an entire moral structure. I think it's a good one. I wish more people would use it. I think the Christian one is a bad one, because it's not it doesn't start at the is, but that's a different conversation that we touched on a little bit. But I think all of that kind of work is like crucially necessary. And then like for this IDW thing, if it's going to mean anything, I hope it has all kinds of conversations like this. I think there's a huge appetite for it. And yeah, like obviously we're friends. That's the easy part.
It's good faith. That's the point, right?
That's the easy part. And always admitting, and to Ryan's point, to borrow something from his protocol, that it's always falsifiable. I've been trying to qualify that I might be wrong, always trying to challenge myself of like what variable would be there in place that would force me to change my mind. If I'm going to be consistent with these logical arguments, what would force me to change my mind about abortion? I don't even lay it out, because I fully admit that it's taking a life, which is why I think the pro-choice argument is like off base from the beginning, and pro-choicers don't know what their argument is, and pro-lifers don't know what their argument is. I'm just telling you, I think the variables of taking that life are perfectly moral to do in the case of abortion, or they're tragic but moral, the same way that killing the kid in the back of the terrorist car is tragic but clearly taking a life of that kid.
Right. And you made me do it.
I made you do it, and so and we could talk about those all day.
Choose to do it.
Yeah,
I still had the choice.
I'll tell you, if anyone's still watching at the end of this very long conversation, my new project is a podcast. And it's all about moral dilemmas. So I'm like, my mind is very tuned to this kind of conversation at the moment. It's just called Dilemma. Coleman Hughes is my co-host. It's gonna be a ton of fun. I love him. He's amazing, and he's a PhD philosopher, so he could do all of this even way better than I am. It's gonna be really fun. So every episode, we have 16 episodes in the first season, and a great list of guests that I've been recording with people like John Haidt and Steve Pinker and Sean Carroll and Susan Wolf is going to be our first one. Eric Kaplan, who I mentioned. We have 16 really awesome people. And some of them are psychologists, some of them are philosophers, some of them are in entertainment, some of them are hard scientists. Really,
We'll totally listen.
It's going to be super fun, and they're really fun. Like the first one, totally ironically, the first one that we're going to release probably in June. Susan Wolf is the featured one for that one. I recorded it the same week as the Notre Dame thing, and the dilemma was called Fire at the Louvre, and it was basically like, do you save the Mona Lisa or a person who's passed out next to it? There are all these like awful moral dilemma situations that.
Hey, but like.
Okay, that's like, do you let Harambe maybe like crush the 4-year-old, or do you?
That's a good one.
Shoot Harambe.
Well, that's a really
so. What I hope to do, if the show catches on a little bit, we're going to do some live episodes where we're going to have like audience requested and suggested dilemmas, so we could do that. That's a good one, actually. I mean,
I was totally for shooting that effing gorilla, like that 4-year-old.
Yeah.
A lot of people weren't though.
4 years old, and that would be an interesting one, because the fun thing on that show is they're really just conversation starters, the way that we went off on other tangents here, because you start with the fire at the Louvre and a Mona Lisa versus a person, and you have your intuition and you answer it certain ways, but then you start playing with the variables of like, okay, let's say you see a swastika armband on the person, now do you save them?
Or who escaped, who murdered, I don't know, your brother, I don't know.
What the person who, like if there's a personal thing, or you change the Mona Lisa because you're like, I hate that painting, and you're like, okay, let's make it the entire Louvre. You start playing with all the variables and see where the borders of your moral frameworks
sort of break down.
I save the person, but okay.
You save the person. I mean, I could push on it for you. I mean, the fun part of that show is I think I save the person too, but
I think I always save the people, like no matter what, I think.
What if it's the entire Louvre and just one person?
Yes, even the entire Louvre. The one life is worth it.
What if it's so and you know what's funny about these dilemmas, and even thinking, and why I find it useful to like move from the abortion thing to some crazy example of a terrorist driving a car, is I think I share your intuition, like save the people, who cares about the fucking stuff, but like we make that choice all the time. Like when we see ISIS destroying artifacts in Syria, it's like gut-wrenching to watch that stuff. When we see the videos of them just smashing like ancient cities that, you know, are 10,000 years old and stuff, and it's awful. And we devote resources and troops to protect those things. And in some zero-sum game, those are troops that could be used to protect Yazidi lives or real human lives in the conflict. I know there's other variables there that make it complicated, but like it feels really easy for us to be like, you know, save. Well, literally right now, everyone's giving all this money to like rebuild Notre Dame, and it feels great. Presumably that's money that could be going to like, you know, save dying babies somewhere. And like we make the choice indirectly all the time to save the Mona Lisa.
There's sort of negative responsibility associated with this.
Yeah.
I think that's a thing, a philosophical thing, negative responsibility.
It's
commission and omission is sort of the philosophical like line that's always really interesting of the like, because with the classic trolley problem, as you know, almost everyone says, well, you know, kill the one rather than the five.
But the utilitarian argument, isn't that more the means justify the ends, right? And then the deontological is it's
like a consequential / utilitarian. Yeah. But for the omission commission thing, when you change it to the what's called the bridge problem of you're standing on a bridge next to a fat man over this out of control trolley, and you can push this fat man onto the track.
That's where the negative responsibility comes in.
And it will kill him, but the 5 will live. Most people are like, I don't want to do it, even though the math is exactly the same, but it's this commission versus omission
okay,
thing.
so you making me push the button to
Yeah.
get the kid. That was more of a commission thing. Whereas,
But then I let you say, like, what if I'll push the button? Do you think I'm immoral?
oh, you're right. Okay, you gave me a little bit.
Which frankly I think is, and actually that's the way Susan Wolf, who's a tremendous philosopher, she wrote an incredible influential essay in 1982. She has been around, called Moral Saints, that is worth a read. I mean, it's like classic moral philosophy. She preferred to talk about, I think, which is really smart, the decision that way, which I think is actually like really useful rhetoric of like, rather than say it's an immoral act to save the Mona Lisa or it's an immoral act to save the thing, it's like, if a security guard makes the decision to save the Mona Lisa, would you think they had done an immoral thing? Or if the security guard makes the decision to save the person, would you think they did an immoral thing? Which actually is like a much nicer thing, because she's like, you know, because it's a good moral dilemma, it's like both decisions are shitty. And I would comfort him and try to make him feel good about whatever choice he made, because they both have arguments. But you push that far enough and maybe the argument, you know, gets, if he saved the Mona Lisa, I wouldn't have done it, but I'd been like, I get it, man. I hope, you know, it's a tough one. But if he saved the Mona Lisa over like 100 people, I would be like, I think you're kind of an asshole. like at some point it starts to go like, I can't really defend him anymore. But with me, killing, there was, how many people did I put at that wedding? It was a big wedding. It was a festive wedding.
Was it like 500?
I said like 500 people, and they were like great people.
And I had to kill that poor little kid. You know, you would probably be like, I get it, Jay. Like, that was a tough call. Like,
that sucks.
Yeah,
that sucks.
I would. But then, okay, I'm just going to go back to the Harambe problem. Like, I think I had a 4-year-old at the time.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Huh.
So I think I was like, yeah. Because I could empathize, because I had a 4-year-old at the time.
With that one, you know what's funny? We should do the Harambe one. You should be on that.
Isn't even a question, though. I don't even understand.
But can I change?
Because this is how my mind works. Can I change the variable? Because the Harambe one is like immediately complicated for me because of the morality of zoos, first of all, which is like a huge thing. But what if that kid was on like a safari in Africa and ran off of the bus just on his own, and then a gorilla had him? You still are like, shoot the fucking gorilla?
I think I'm like those idiot parents, but yes, the kid, it's a kid, right? As well. Change it to an adult though. Maybe it's a little.
Yeah.
But like ramming it with the car versus a gun, like trying to scare it away. I like adult versus kid as well. Kind of.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because I haven't thought much about the Harambe case, but I wonder if some people change their intuition based on, or disagree with you based on like, it's a zoo and we put him there, and so like we didn't, you know.
It
to be put there.
It didn't ask to be in the zoo, and now it has to be
have kids around it anyway, and well, the zoo didn't make the flipping like wall high enough, like jeepers.
Well, what's nice and what's good about this, and even like to like even wrap it up with the abortion thing, is my like mantra on the show, and at the end of every show is basically like the role of all of us as thinkers and designers and architects, or whatever our role is we should try to build a world where no one's ever in a moral dilemma. Like clearly, if the zoo built that fucking wall high enough, then you solved that problem.
But then there's always fires in Notre Dame, or
there will always be dilemmas. But sometimes
we can. Yeah, there will always be unforeseen problems that we will create while we're fixing the dilemmas. But if we somehow had more, I think consciousness would be the thing for abortion. But if we somehow had more knowledge from the ises of the world, that could inform that situation, maybe we could design or figure out some way that it would be less of a dilemma at some point. Okay. We're not even close to that one on abortion, so it feels like a really hard one. But
more knowledge, more knowledge is always a good thing. I think that's
always a good thing.
Knowing what is can help inform the ought.
Yes, well, yes, because I think a lot of people who maybe rightfully say it's impossible to get an ought from an is, just then sever all facts about the universe from moral facts. And I think, and those people are making a monumental mistake. Sam's book, The Moral Landscape, was kind of all about this. I think he makes a couple of little legal moves in there logically, but is all about this, that of course scientific facts, or scientific facts being defined as facts that can be adjudicated by the evidence of the universe, relate and inform moral facts.
Help inform, and it depends on the degree to which we're talking about. That's where the discrepancy is, I think.
Yeah, can and I would say should, which is, I know, a moral judgment, but can and should, which relates all the way back to our conversation about telling stories about the ises that are actually about the ises.